Prohibition in Canada ended like 100 years ago, right? Well, not around here. Here, it only ended about a quarter of a century ago. I'm in the Junction. This was Toronto's last dry neighborhood, and by a long shot. So, why didn't Prohibition end here when it ended other places? There's a bit of a story to that. Temperance movements grew throughout the 19th century, initially focusing on hard liquor and then expanding to oppose all forms of alcohol. Prohibitionists cited a number of grounds for their opposition, including religious, social, and health reasons. For instance, they argued that alcohol corroded the moral fiber of society, contributed to an increase in crime, including domestic abuse, and caused poverty. A number of existing organizations, such as the Salvation Army, jumped on the bandwagon, and a number of brand new organizations, such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, sprung up just to advocate for prohibition. Here's their building on Gerrard Street as it looked back in the day, and here's how the same building looks today. But people want to drink. According to the 1851 census of Upper Canada, the ratio of taverns to people was better than 1 to 500. And by about a decade later, there were apparently around 1,000 stores and other businesses in Toronto selling alcohol. So, just like anywhere and any time that the authorities try to ban alcohol, people find a way. Some of the ways are obvious, like speakeasies and bootleggers. Other ways, the workarounds are a little more clever. In 1904, Toronto enacted a ban on the sale of alcohol on Sundays. After all, we shouldn't be going out on the Lord's Day to buy booze and get drunk, should we? Remember, Toronto was a pretty uptight place back then. It was largely run by Protestants, with very firm notions of morality. You know, Toronto the good. A number of Protestant denominations forbade alcohol to their members, and in turn, some of their members sought to do the same to everyone else. In 1918, as a temporary war measure, the federal government enacted a ban on alcohol. They repealed it the following year after the war had ended, but most provinces got around to prohibition even before the feds did. 1916 brought the province the Ontario Temperance Act, which largely banned the sale of alcoholic beverages in Ontario. Note that I said sale. It did not ban the purchase of alcoholic beverages in Ontario. So, after the war ended and the federal government lifted its ban on alcohol, one of those workarounds popped up. People started importing deliveries of alcohol from other provinces, especially Quebec, where the alcohol laws were much more relaxed than here in Ontario. So in 1921, the provincial government held another referendum on whether alcoholic imports should be banned. That referendum passed and the loophole was closed. There was another exception in the law for medicinal and sacramental purposes, and the medicinal exception turned into another of those workarounds. Pharmacies could sell alcohol to anybody who was prescribed it by a doctor. In 1920, something like 650,000 prescriptions were written by Ontario doctors for patients who needed alcohol for medicinal purposes. These next two ones sound a little fishy to me, but there are reports of doctors who wrote as many as 2,000 prescriptions a month for alcohol, and even of one doctor who saw 500 patients in one day who required alcohol for medicinal purposes. The government closed that loophole by restricting each doctor to 40 such prescriptions a month. The 1916 law enacting prohibition in Ontario required a follow-up referendum 3 years later on whether to continue with prohibition. The vote in that referendum was strongly in favor of continuing. But things changed by 1924 when a subsequent referendum was held, and only 52% of Ontarians voting in that referendum wanted to continue prohibition. Notably, the vote in Toronto was overwhelmingly opposed to continuing prohibition, as was the case in a number of other cities. Not coincidentally, the governing party of the day depended on many of these cities for a lot of its seats, and so it enacted a law allowing low-alcohol beer to be sold in Ontario. And in its campaign platform for the 1926 provincial election, they proposed repealing prohibition. They won, and in 1927, they repealed prohibition in Ontario. Incidentally, there have been 6 times that Ontario has held a provincial referendum. All but one of them dealt with prohibition. The 1924 referendum that I mentioned was the last one until the 2007 electoral reform referendum. But this area had been dry for several years by that point. In 1878, the Canada Temperance Act was enacted, essentially taking a pre-Confederation law from Upper and Lower Canada, allowing jurisdictions to ban alcohol by popular vote and extending it across the brand new country. By the time of the temporary federal prohibition on alcohol in World War I, there were hundreds of dry communities in Ontario, including the Junction. Now, this was largely a working class neighbourhood with things like rail yards and factories and meatpacking plants, the latter of which contributed to Toronto's nickname of Hogtown. Drink was a problem, as were drunken fights. So in 1904, the residents of the Junction voted to turn their neighbourhood dry. Here are the current boundaries of the Junction neighbourhood according to the City of Toronto's website. But like so many other parts of the city, the boundaries have changed and the name has changed a number of times over the years as Toronto and surrounding areas grew through annexing each other. In 1909, with much larger boundaries than today's neighbourhood, the Junction agreed to join the City of Toronto, but only on condition that it remained dry. There were 4 failed attempts to repeal the ban by referendum from 1966 through to 1988. Finally, on the 5th try, in 1997, a referendum to repeal the ban succeeded. It took a few years for all the restrictions to be eased, but by 2001, the people of the Junction finally had the same access to alcohol as everyone else. Now, you may have noticed I'm standing in a park, and in a lot of parts of the world, this will be a place where you could drink alcohol. But remember, we're uptight here. A few years ago, the provincial government passed a law allowing municipalities to legalize drinking in parks if they wish to do so. In 2023, the City of Toronto started a pilot program to find out if allowing drinking in parks would trigger the end of the world as we know it. They started with a couple of dozen parks, but only in certain parts of the city, because city councillors were given the option for their wards to opt in or out of the program, and apparently some of our councillors are party poopers. In early 2024, the results of that came back to City Council. The pilot program was a resounding success. So in typical Toronto fashion, the program was expanded, slightly. There are now about 50 parks scattered throughout the city, with at least one in each ward where drinking is legal for the second phase of the pilot program. According to the city's website, there are thousands of parks in Toronto, so maybe sometime in the next several decades, most of them will have drinking allowed. The interesting part is, here in the Junction, none of the parks allow drinking. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video, perhaps with an adult beverage in hand. If you did, you know what to do. Please like and subscribe.